the Prohibition movement in Canada never receives enough support to establish a national law. The majority of Canadians were well informed that south of the border, the noble experiment was failing. Each province in Canada, free to change its legislation, began to repeal. Quebec was the first, repealing Prohibition after only 12 months in 1921. By 1925, an additional 4 provinces had repealed their Prohibition laws. Prince Edward Island proved to be the driest of all. The island was the very last province in Canada to repeal Prohibition in 1948. While many provinces considered new legislation, local plebiscites revealed that most Canadian voters favored some form of alcohol control. Rather than returning to the open system that existed before Prohibition, Manitoba's voters would be the first to put the government in control of the liquor business. And as a result, the tax revenue rolled in. Soon, every Canadian province would adopt some form of government control.
It's really a radical intervention. The government goes into the liquor business, right? The free market is gone. Entire classes of business are wiped out. There are no longer liquor wholesalers, for example. In many provinces, there are no private liquor stores. The government has the liquor store.
The government was missing out on that tax, and they get in on the racket. And when the liquor stores come in, then they could start taking that money that was being lost. So they realized there was money to be made in it, and they get in it in a big way.
South of the border, many states were considering what to do once the 18th Amendment was repealed. U.S. government officials were open to consider many options, including those from other countries.
A number of states sent fact-finding missions to Canada to study the Quebec system, the BC system, the Ontario system, and came back with reports on how these systems work.
Despite the growing backlash, national prohibition drags on in the United States. While America debated the end of alcohol control, the unthinkable happens. On October 29, 1929, the stock market crashes, throwing America into the Great Depression. The United States government now desperately needed cash to stay afloat.
The federal government is running on fumes. The income tax collections go down by over 30% with the Depression. The capital gains tax disappears entirely because nobody has capital gains from 1929 to 1933. The government doesn't have any money to operate on, much less have the money they need to spend to pull the country out of the Depression.
Following the election of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932, the final repeal of the 18th Amendment was inevitable. In the first 12 months after repeal, the taxation of alcohol accounted for 9% of all federal tax revenue.
Suddenly, people had jobs again. Tens of thousands of people went back to work in the first few weeks at the end of Prohibition. So, like Prohibition coming in for reasons that have nothing to do with alcohol, Prohibition leaves for reasons that have nothing to do with alcohol.
On St. Pierre and Miquelon, the writing was on the wall for the island's economy. Distillers were now signing month-to-month leases for a warehouse space, a direct sign that the liquor business could disappear at a moment's notice. When news about the end of Prohibition reached St. Pierre, the local cartage operators, who were heavily involved in the transportation of liquor from the warehouses, would formally commemorate the end of an era.
In 1933, there's actually a funeral for Prohibition that takes place with the French flag, the American flag, flying at half-staff because they knew that their incredible financial bonanza was over.
The days of rum-running schooners, sailing the rugged Atlantic coast with boatloads of Canadian whiskey bound for American markets, had ended. The smugglers, who faced the dangers of avoiding law enforcement at sea, were finding more traditional ways to make a living. For many of the rum-running crews, all that remained was an enduring memory of the rum-running trade and its past glory. At the end of Prohibition, Captain Bill McCoy had been finished with rum-running for over a decade. In 1923, McCoy was arrested off the coast of New Jersey by the U.S. Coast Guard, caught on board the Arethusa with a cargo of illegal liquor. his vessel was seized, and McCoy was thrown in jail for a year. He never returned to the trade. Years later, his beloved vessel, the Arethusa, which had been sold at auction, ran aground off Sambro, Nova Scotia. Hearing about the wreck, McCoy made one last trip to Nova Scotia in the mid-1930s to view what remained of his once proud vessel. He posed for pictures among the remains of the Arethusa, and before leaving, he cut the main beam where the registry tonnage had been carved and took it home to remind him of the vessel's glory days. While the noble experiment was unsuccessful in its attempt to control people's habits, the end of Prohibition forced governments on both sides of the borders to consider legislation that encouraged the responsible consumption of alcohol.
During the 14 years of Prohibition, a speakeasy owner, a liquor distributor, a rum runner, they would bribe the cops, they would bribe the Prohibition agents, and then sell to anybody. There were no age limits, there were no closing hours, anything went. You know, if a 9-year-old wanted to buy liquor in the middle of the night across the street from his school, there was somebody there to sell it to him. In comes, after repeal, a series of regulatory laws that become critically important to those people who were selling liquor, which is to say they had a license, and that license could be taken away from them if they served to that 9-year-old or served in the middle of the night when there were closing hours.
Prohibition coincided with an incredible period of social change in both Canada and the United States. During that time, women in both countries received the right to vote. Canada changed its voting rights in 1917, and the United States followed in 1920. Now that consuming alcohol was once again legal, the reforms that were to follow would include the voice of women. It was a time of change that would profoundly affect popular culture.
Prohibition did open up new opportunities for women to advance the cause of women's equality. In the 1920s, there was a vicious backlash against the first wave of feminism. And that's all the images I feel that we have of women as angry battle axes smashing up saloons comes out of that backlash. If you look at figures like Edith Archibald or Nellie McClung, they were quite elegant ladies. We see the flapper become the dominant icon of females in the 1920s, cute and sexy, but powerless. And so the idea that the flapper is in any way a progress from the suffragist just doesn't hold water.
Prohibition changed our social life in many, many ways. The key distinction, I think, is that until Prohibition, the saloon was a male-only institution. The only woman you would find in saloons would be the owner's wife, perhaps. But when laws change and institutions change as a result, the saloon is replaced by the speakeasy, even though it may be the same building, the same proprietor. Now, you know, it's kind of exciting. It's a little bit different. Women begin to come in. What's it like inside this place? Well, once you have men and women drinking together, you've got to have music. And once you have music, you get the spread of jazz, which is directly attributable to Prohibition.
Over the years, physical reminders of Prohibition have become harder to find. On St. Pierre, one of the more unique artifacts remaining are some of the thousands of empty contraband liquor bottles which were discarded at sea years after repeal.
At a certain stage, it was making too much of a mess. They decided to take the bottles. There were these sort of barges with double bottoms that you could open, which would open and they could submerge what was in it. So with the new diving equipment that you have today, you are able to access much deeper depths that you could back in the 30s. So he was able to go down and retrieve hundreds of these bottles, which when they came up were full of coral. But as they are mostly all embossed with the different names of the producers, well, you could, once you've dipped them in a acid solution to dissolve the coral, they're beautiful shiny bottles that have lived 50 years of their existence below the surface of the water.
Recalling the days when a social drink was a crime, or when the thought of vast fortunes from smuggling illegal alcohol could lure a man to venture on the high seas and risk his life. Long after Prohibition has ended, with the lessons of that era lying on the pages of history books for all to read, we continue to face the same challenges when society confronts legislating morality.
Can you legislate morality if you're creating a black market, an illicit market? What harms does that illicit market do to the society, right, in terms of public health, in terms of crime, in terms of lost revenue, disrespect for the justice system? All those same issues were raised during Prohibition and have been raised, by writers and critics of Prohibition ever since.
North America's experiment with the idealistic notion of controlling people's habits had ended in failure. While the ultimate goal of temperance was unsuccessful, the actual lessons of Prohibition may be the unintended consequences of a legislation which reshaped society in so many profound ways. Prohibition became an era when women would assert their ability to organize politically and promote their ideas for a better society. The illicit trade of alcohol would make a boon town out of the island of St. Pierre and solidify the importance of Coast Guard enforcement across North America. Ultimately, it turned law-abiding citizens like Bill McCoy and Jack Randall into lawbreakers. Each man driven by desperate financial times would risk everything to earn a living.
I think of one of the ladies, her husband was a rum runner, and while he was out on the North Atlantic transporting liquor around, she was running it around the province in an old car. Would put 2 kegs in the back seat and put hats on top of them. Looked like she had 2 male passengers. And she'd drive around the back roads of Nova Scotia delivering this liquor. Never once stopped by the authorities. And there's a great picture of her sitting astride the bonnet of the car, looking very much like the Bonnie of Bonnie and Clyde. And I mentioned to her, I said, I'd like to have a copy of the picture for the museum, but we don't have to say your name if that would bother you. She said, that doesn't matter. Let them see how I made my money.
During the 1920s and 30s, it wasn't only the people who made the rules that changed society. It was those adventurous and enterprising citizens that looked beyond the constraints of a silly law, who rose above the heavy hand of temperance and changed the course of history in North America, one illegal drink at a time.